The production assistant's name was Claire. She had been working MTV events for 4 years by the time the 1992 Video Music Awards came around, which meant she had developed a very specific skill, the ability to move through backstage corridors quickly, efficiently, and without making eye contact with anyone who might slow her down. She had a clipboard. She had a headset. She had 17 things to do before the second commercial break. She was not supposed to stop. She stopped. It was the t-shirt that did it. She had come around a corner in the backstage corridor of Poly Pavilion at a pace that she would later describe as one step below a jog. And she had nearly walked directly into Kurt Cobain, who was standing at the side of the hallway with a paper cup of something and no particular expression on his face. She apologized. He nodded. Standard backstage interaction, the kind that happened 40 times a night at events like this. And then she saw the t-shirt. Under the open flannel, dark plaid, oversized, the kind of shirt that looked like it had been borrowed and never returned, was a white t-shirt, faded almost to translucence. And on the front of it, unmistakable even in its degraded state, was the face of Michael Jackson, the dangerous era, the white suit, the military jacket, the exact look that Michael Jackson was at that precise moment, somewhere in the same building, wearing. Claire had been working MTV events for 4 years. She understood irony. She understood image. She understood that musicians made deliberate choices about what they wore to the VMAs, that every jacket and every t-shirt and every pair of shoes was either a statement or a counter-statement or a deliberate refusal to make any statement at all. She could not, in that moment, read which one this was. She kept walking. She thought about it for the rest of the night. The person who did not keep walking was a man named Stephen Carr. Stephen was 34 years old and had been working in music television production for 8 years. He had a very good instinct for talent, a very good eye for a story, and a very pronounced habit of saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment with complete confidence that he was saying the right thing. He encountered Kurt approximately 10 minutes after Claire did, in a different section of the same corridor, closer to the production area. Stephen was coming from a debrief meeting. Kurt was, as far as Stephen could tell, simply existing in the corridor, standing, cup in hand, apparently in no hurry to be anywhere. Stephen recognized him, not immediately, and not with the kind of recognition that produces reverence. More the recognition of someone placing a name to a face they've seen in briefing documents. Nirvana, the hospital gown thing, Seattle. He also saw the t-shirt, in Stephen Carr, whose instinct for the wrong thing to say was as reliable as any instinct he possessed, smiled. "That's ironic, right?" he said. "The Michael Jackson shirt." Kurt looked at him. His expression did not change. "I mean," Stephen continued, warming to the idea, "you guys are basically the anti-pop. Grunge versus—" He gestured vaguely, a gesture that was meant to encompass Michael Jackson, pop music, the entire preceding decade of American radio. "It's a statement, I get it. Very on brand." Kurt was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. Stephen waited for more. More did not come. "No?" Stephen said. "I just like the music," Kurt said. Stephen laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has decided that a simple answer must be concealing a more complicated one. That "I just like the music" was a deflection, a way of refusing to explain the joke, and that the joke was definitely there if you looked for it. "Sure," Stephen said, still smiling. "Very understated." Kurt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at whatever he'd been looking at before Stephen arrived. A point somewhere down the corridor. Unremarkable. Apparently sufficient. Stephen stood there for a beat longer than was comfortable. He had the feeling, which he was not accustomed to having, of having been gently and completely dismissed without a single dismissive word being spoken. He walked away. He told the story at the production debrief later that evening as a funny anecdote. The irony of the Michael Jackson shirt, the deadpan delivery, very on brand, very Seattle. His colleagues laughed. It was a good story in the way that backstage stories are good stories. Quick, texture-rich, requiring no follow-up. He had not yet understood what the story was actually about. That would take longer. The performance happened approximately 40 minutes later. Nirvana's set had been a subject of considerable internal discussion before the VMAs. The network had requested "Smells Like Teen Spirit." The band had refused. A sequence of negotiations had produced a compromise in which Nirvana agreed to perform, and the network agreed to let them perform whatever they wanted, which in retrospect was the kind of agreement that looks very different before it happens than after. What happened was this. Kurt Cobain walked onto the stage of the Pauley Pavilion in a faded flannel shirt and a Michael Jackson t-shirt and a hospital gown over the top of all of it, and he stood at the microphone, and for a moment he simply stood there, not performing the act of waiting, not playing the crowd, just standing, with the particular quality of stillness that some performers have and most don't. The stillness that isn't absence, but is instead a form of pressure. Then the band started. They did not play "Smells Like Teen Spirit." They played "Lithium." And then somewhere in the opening verse, Kurt Cobain briefly collapsed against the microphone stand. Not fully, not dramatically, a controlled fall and catch that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. And then he continued, and his voice, when it came back out of the speakers, sounded exactly the same as it had before, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had sounded different. Stephen Carr was watching from the production area. He was watching the monitors, which was where the production people watched during a live broadcast, because the monitors gave you angles and data and a sense of the overall picture that standing in the crowd did not. He was watching professionally, which meant he was thinking about camera cuts and timing and whether the next segment was ready. And then something happened to the way he was watching. It was not a dramatic shift. It was not a moment he could have pointed to precisely afterward. It was more that at some point during the performance, he stopped thinking about camera cuts and started thinking about nothing at all, which for Stephen was extremely unusual because Stephen's mind was not in the habit of going quiet. The song ended. The applause came up. Stephen realized his clipboard was at his side, and he had no memory of lowering it. He found Claire in the corridor afterward. She was moving quickly again, clipboard and headset, post-show logistics. He fell into step beside her. "The t-shirt," he said. Claire looked at him sideways. "The Michael Jackson t-shirt," Stephen said. "You saw it too." "I nearly walked into him," Claire said, "before the show." "I told him it was ironic," Stephen said. Claire stopped walking. She turned and looked at him with the expression of someone who has just been told something that explains several things simultaneously. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said he just liked the music," Stephen said. Claire was quiet for a moment. "And then you laughed," she said. It wasn't a question. Stephen didn't answer immediately. "I thought it was a deflection," he said. "It wasn't a deflection," Claire said. "No," Stephen said. "It wasn't." The thing about the t-shirt, the thing that Stephen would spend a surprisingly long time turning over in the months and eventually years afterward, was that it was not a costume. This was the distinction that mattered. Stephen worked in television, which meant he worked in a world where everything worn on camera was either a costume or a deliberate inversion of a costume, and both of those things were still costumes. The hospital gown was a costume. The flannel was arguably a costume in the sense that it was a uniform, a signifier, the visual language of a particular identity. But the t-shirt was under the flannel. The t-shirt was the part that wasn't supposed to be seen. And what that meant, what Stephen eventually arrived at, not quickly but over time, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives, was that Kurt Cobain had gone to the MTV Video Music Awards in 1992 wearing a Michael Jackson t-shirt not as a statement and not as an ironic gesture and not as anything that required decoding. He had worn it because he owned it and because he liked it. And the flannel was over it because he was cold, or because that was what he wore, or for some other reason that was entirely private and had nothing to do with anyone else's interpretation of what it meant. Stephen left his job in television production in 1996 and spent several years doing other things. He came back to it eventually in a different capacity, working on documentary projects rather than live events. He was better at it the second time, more patient, less certain about what things meant before he'd had time to look at them properly. He told the t-shirt story in an interview in 2005 for a piece about the 1992 VMAs. By then, his telling of it had changed considerably from the version he told at the post-show debrief. The laugh was still in there, because the laugh had happened and he saw no reason to edit it out. But the emphasis had shifted. I thought I understood what it meant immediately, he said in the interview. That's the thing. I was completely sure, and I was completely wrong. Not about the facts, about the meaning. I saw the t-shirt, I put it in a category, I decided what it was, and I told him what I thought it was, and he said two words that were so simple that I literally laughed because I assumed simple meant he wasn't really answering. But he was answering. That was the whole answer. He just liked the music. The interviewer asked if he regretted saying what he'd said. I regret the laugh, Stephen said. The rest of it, saying the wrong thing, misreading what I was looking at, that's just what happens when you're working very fast and you think you know more than you do. The laugh is the part that still bothers me because the laugh was me deciding in real time that my reading of the situation was more accurate than his. And then he walked out there and he stopped. You've seen the performance, he said. The interviewer said that yes, he had. Then you know, Stephen said. There's nothing to add to that. What Stephen did not know, because it was not public knowledge at the time, was that at some point after the VMAs, the exact timing unclear, somewhere in the weeks or months following, Michael Jackson had been told about the t-shirt. Who told him is not on record. What he said when he was told is not on record either, not in its entirety, but someone who was present when he heard it said that Michael had been quiet for a moment and then had said something that the person present remembered as, did he know it was faded or did he just not care? When told that it wasn't clear, that the shirt was very faded, that it might have been bought secondhand, that the face on it was barely visible, Michael had apparently nodded slowly. That's the right way to like something, he had said. And then he had moved on to the next thing, the way Michael Jackson moved on to the next thing, quickly and completely, and the moment had closed behind him. The faded t-shirt was not cataloged. It was not preserved in an archive or donated to a museum or sold at auction. It was, as far as anyone who might have known could determine, simply a t-shirt, worn, washed many more times, lost eventually to the general entropy that overtakes most objects that are not deliberately saved. Claire, the production assistant, left MTV in 1995. She went into documentary work. She became very good at it. She won an award in 2003 for a film about musicians who had died young, which required her to spend considerable time thinking about the relationship between a person and the image of that person, and about what gets preserved and what gets lost, and about the difference between the two. She never put the t-shirt in the film. She thought about it. She decided it belonged somewhere else. Or nowhere, which was also a kind of belonging. Stephen Carr, in the 2005 interview, was asked one final question. The interviewer asked whether he thought Kurt Cobain knew what the performance would be like before he walked on stage, whether he knew what he was going to do, whether the collapse against the microphone was planned. Stephen thought about this for a moment. I think he knew what he felt, Stephen said. I don't think he planned anything. I think he felt something, and he walked out there and let it happen, and what came out was what was in there. That's not planning. That's something else. He paused. He told me he just liked the music, Stephen said. I thought that was the least interesting answer he could have given. It turned out to be the most interesting answer. I just didn't know how to hear it yet. The corridor's empty now. The chairs are different chairs, or the same chairs in different positions, or gone entirely. The cup is gone. The t-shirt is gone. What remains is the performance. The 2 seconds of a controlled fall and catch that nobody watching could be entirely sure was intentional. The voice coming back out of the speaker sounding exactly the same as it had before. The song finishing, the applause coming up. And somewhere, in the accounting of that night, a producer standing in front of a monitor with a clipboard at his side and no memory of lowering it, and a faded t-shirt under a flannel shirt, barely visible, worn because it was owned and liked. The right way to like something, not because anyone was watching, but because the music sat somewhere real and the realness of it didn't require an explanation or a category or a laugh. It just required a person willing to wear it under everything else and not explain why. That was all. That was enough.